The fundamental problem with large-scale environmental transitions is that they do not advertise themselves through dramatic disruptions. They arrive through small, administrative changes in human routine. On Thursday, July 16, 2026, a metropolitan area of 4 million residents awoke to an atmospheric reading that shattered the standard operational parameters of regional environmental monitoring. Over metropolitan Detroit, sensors registered an air quality index of approximately 724. On the standardized international scale, any value exceeding 300 is categorized as hazardous, triggering strict protocols that advise the general population to suspend all outdoor activity and seek sealed shelter. The documented level over Detroit was more than double that critical upper limit, effectively moving beyond the designated categories of standard monitoring charts. This event was not preceded by local industrial failures, structural explosions, or volcanic activity. The source was entirely external, carried across the international border on a routine summer air mass and deposited into the surface boundary layer, the dense zone of air that human beings directly inhale. The physical origin of this plume was a cluster of approximately 800 active wildfires burning simultaneously across the Canadian forest belt, emitting combustion products that moved south across the Upper Peninsula, settled into the lower state, and blanketed the urban core. This spatial trajectory is not unprecedented. 3 years prior, in the early summer of 2023, fires from these same northern latitudes delivered smoke plumes that degraded air quality in New York City, reduced solar irradiance in Washington, and crossed the Atlantic Ocean basin into Europe. The critical anomaly of the July 16th event, however, lies in a profound contradiction contained within official government metrics. According to updates issued by Canadian forestry agencies just 1 week prior, the total area burned in the 2026 fire season to date was running below the 5-year historical average. This metric exposes a severe systemic paradox. A fire season officially classified as below average in total burned area retains sufficient intensity and mass transport capacity to deliver hazardous air to a major industrial center over 1,000 miles from the ignition source. This discrepancy indicates that the operational definition of an average fire season has experienced an unannounced structural shift. The baseline itself has moved. The physical mechanism governing this phenomenon extends far beyond local air quality events. The northern forest belt circling the high latitudes represents the largest terrestrial carbon reservoir on Earth. For over 10,000 years, since the retreat of the last glacial sheets, this northern ecosystem operated as a net carbon sink, systematically extracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through plant photosynthesis and locking it away in cold waterlogged soils, thick peat layers, and permafrost. The structural stability of this global carbon vault depended on low temperatures that inhibited microbial decomposition. Today, those conditions are being dismantled. The wildfires currently sweeping through the boreal zone are not merely removing surface tree cover, they are igniting the deep organic soil layers, transforming a multi-millennial carbon vault into a massive point source of atmospheric carbon. The crucial question that emerges from this systemic shift is whether the fundamental balance of this planetary biome has permanently crossed the threshold from a carbon sink to a carbon source, and if so, what structural limits remain to prevent this feedback loop from running unchecked. To evaluate the true magnitude of this shift, one must examine the physical architecture of the northern forest belt. Encircling the high latitudes of Canada and Eurasia, the boreal forest constitutes the single largest continuous forest ecosystem on Earth, dwarfing even the Amazon basin in total geographical footprint. While tropical rainforests store the majority of their carbon in visible surface vegetation, the boreal biome operates on an inverse structural principle. Its modest, slow-growing conifers serve merely as an elevated canopy. The true mass of the system lies beneath the surface, stored in dense moss, deep peat layers, and permafrost that have accumulated layer by layer over 10,000 years. Scientific estimates indicate that the boreal forest stores between 30 and 40% of all terrestrial carbon on Earth, with its subterranean soil deposit holding roughly equal to, and by some metrics double, the total volume of carbon currently present in the entire Earth atmosphere. The stability of this vast underground reservoir terroir, relies on a thermal control mechanism. In warmer climates, dead plant matter breaks down rapidly via microbial decay, returning its carbon to the atmosphere within months. In the frozen, oxygen-deprived northern soils, decomposition is virtually halted. Cold in time lock the carbon away. However, as regional temperatures rise, this balance is destroyed. Increased thermal loading lengthens the burning season, dries out deep organic soils, and converts wet peatlands into dense, combustible fuel beds. The fire rhythm that historically sustained the ecosystem through periodic surface clearing has broken down. Fires now burn hotter, penetrate deeper, and return with greater frequency, preventing the forest from fully recovering its lost mass before the next burn event. The consequences of this mechanism were conclusively documented during the record-setting 2023 Canadian fire season. Over the course of that single season, fires consumed more than 18 million hectares of forest, an area larger than the state of Florida and more than double the previous historical record. The total volume of carbon released was estimated between 2 and 3 billion tons, or roughly 647 megatons of pure carbon, measured via satellite instruments. To place this output into context, the carbon emissions from that single fire season exceeded the entire annual fossil fuel output of major industrial nations like Germany or Japan, matching 4 times the total annual emissions of the entire global aviation industry. For several months, a natural forest ecosystem functioned as the 4th largest single carbon-emitting entity on the planet. Unlike industrial emissions, which are calculated, capped, and regulated under international treaties, these biogenic carbon surges remain completely unaccounted for in standard national carbon accounting ledgers. They represent an unmonitored, unbilled, and unregulated flux entering the global climate system. When fires penetrate deep into the organic soil layer, they ignite legacy carbon, organic matter that survives centuries of previous surface fires. Reaching this layer alters the baseline storage capacity of the ecosystem. Furthermore, these deep fires frequently transition into overwintering or zombie fires, smoldering underground beneath heavy snow cover for months before reigniting on the surface the following spring. This continuous subterranean combustion, combined with the thermal degradation of permafrost that releases carbon dioxide and high-potency methane for decades post-fire, seals a continuous self-reinforcing loop. The warming atmosphere dries the forest, the burning forest releases legacy carbon, and the released carbon drives further warming. The ultimate impact of this cycle is paid directly in human health. During the 2023 season, the transboundary transport of fine particulate matter under 2.5 micrometers affected over 354 million people across North America and Europe. Because these microparticles bypass human respiratory filtration mechanisms and enter the bloodstream directly, health studies attributed approximately 82,000 premature deaths globally to that single season of boreal smoke, with over 33,000 chronic deaths occurring within the United States alone. The hazardous air over Detroit on July 16, 2026 was not an isolated localized anomaly, but the direct, physical consequence of a planetary carbon vault operating in reverse. To fully grasp why this transformation is so difficult for modern regulatory systems to manage, one must deconstruct the persistent myths that obscure its true physical nature. Whenever smoke from Canadian forests darkens the skies of North American cities, popular discourse quickly fractures into superficial explanations. Claims arise that these events are the result of deliberate arson, geoengineering, or simple bureaucratic mismanagement of forest brush. These narratives exist because human psychology naturally seeks a localized, intentional agent to blame for systemic disruptions. However, when evaluated against the physical energy budgets and spatial scales recorded by satellite observations, these alternative explanations collapse under the weight of hard data. A wildfire complex capable of consuming 18 million hectares and releasing thousands of megatons of carbon cannot be engineered by isolated human actors or mitigated by simple surface clearance. The driving force is not a set of localized matches, but an unprecedented regional shift in fire weather. The precise atmospheric alignment of sustained high temperatures, severe relative humidity deficits, and prolonged regional drought. In 2023, and again in 2026, vast swaths of the northern continent experienced weather conditions that transform millions of square kilometers of moist, living forest into highly volatile fuel beds. When fuel moisture drops below critical thresholds, a single natural lightning strike can ignite an inferno that moves moves faster, and burns hotter than any human intervention can contain. Furthermore, popular belief holds that forest fires are fundamentally neutral events because trees inevitably regrow, drawing back an equal volume of carbon from the atmosphere over time. This assumption relies on the concept of a balanced natural ledger, but it fails to account for the physical distinction between surface vegetation and subterranean legacy carbon. When a fast-growing aspen or birch tree matures over 30 years, it accumulates carbon in its above-ground trunk and leaves. However, the carbon released when deep peat and permafrost ignite took over 10,000 years to collect in the frozen earth. You cannot erase a multi-millennial withdrawal from the planetary carbon vault with 30 years of surface vegetation growth. The math simply does not balance. Moreover, in many regions subjected to high-frequency or high-intensity burning, post-fire regeneration fails entirely. Instead of returning as dense conifer forest, the land transitions into low-density shrubland or grassland, which possess only a small fraction of the original carbon storage capacity. The vault is not being refilled. Its total physical volume is being permanently downsized. This shift is further compounded by the transport of dark carbon particulates, or soot, which rise within the fire plumes and drift northward toward the Arctic Ocean basin. When these dark particles settle onto the bright, highly reflective surfaces of Arctic snow and ice, they dramatically reduce the planet's albedo, its natural capacity to reflect solar radiation back into space. The darkened ice absorbs significantly more heat, accelerating the rate of thaw and exposing even deeper layers of permafrost to atmospheric degradation. This represents a secondary physical feedback loop, operating parallel to direct carbon dioxide emissions and accelerating the thermal destruction of the northern latitudes. What occurred over Detroit on July 16, 2026, was the manifestation of a system where every individual feedback mechanism reinforces the next. The warming atmosphere increases fire weather. Fire weather ignites ancient legacy carbon and generates black soot. Carbon emissions and reduced ice albedo drive further atmospheric warming. This is the rigid architectural logic of a natural system pushed beyond its structural limit. The air hanging over American cities is no longer just seasonal weather. It is the unbilled interest on a deep environmental debt carried on the wind from a vault that has finally begun to run empty. The structural transformation of the northern biosphere directly impacts the human populations living downwind, turning macro geophysical changes into acute personal risks. When an urban center like Detroit experiences an air quality index exceeding 700, the event is often processed through familiar mental models of temporary pollution spikes such as industrial smog or vehicular exhaust. This interpretation fundamentally miscalculates the physical composition and biological behavior of forest fire exhaust. Boreal smoke is a dense chemical cocktail composed of carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, and vast quantities of fine particulate matter under 2.5 micrometers in diameter, known as PM 2.5. To understand the cellular threat of PM 2.5, consider the scale. A single human hair measures roughly 70 micrometers in width, meaning dozens of these combustion particles could sit across its surface. Because of their submicroscopic dimensions, these particles completely bypass the upper respiratory system's structural defense mechanisms, such as nasal cilia and mucus barriers, penetrating deep into the pulmonary alveoli, where oxygen transfer occurs. From the alveoli, PM 2.5 crosses directly into the human vascular system. Once inside the bloodstream, these combustion products trigger systemic arterial inflammation, accelerate blood clotting, and place severe physical stress on the cardiovascular architecture. Consequently, during acute smoke inundation events, medical emergencies extend far beyond respiratory conditions like asthma or bronchitis. Hospital admissions spike for acute myocardial infarctions, ischemic strokes, and sudden cardiac failures, as pre-existing vascular vulnerabilities are pushed past their structural tolerances. During the 2023 season, an estimated 354 million people across North America and Europe were subjected to elevated PM 2.5 levels, resulting in roughly 82,000 premature deaths. Over 33,000 of those deaths occurred in the United States alone, 4 times the toll recorded within Canada itself. This asymmetrical distribution reveals a stark geopolitical reality. The severe biological cost of northern forest degradation is borne primarily by populations hundreds or thousands of miles downwind. The vulnerability is especially acute among children, whose developing lungs possess higher breathing rates relative to body mass, absorbing greater volumetric doses of toxic particulates per kilogram of weight. The long-term physiological impact of chronic childhood exposure to high-density forest smoke includes permanently reduced lung capacity and altered pulmonary tissue development, laying a foundation for elevated disease risk across an entire generation. When municipal authorities issue directives for residents to remain indoors, keep children inside during school recess, and set residential HVAC systems to internal recirculation, these measures are not administrative precautions. They represent tactical retreats in the face of an atmospheric regime shift that modern infrastructure was never designed to mitigate. The traditional separation between pristine wilderness and industrial urbanization has dissolved. The ancient carbon that once stabilized global temperatures underground is now circulating through the lungs of urban residents across the northern hemisphere. The hazardous air settling over Detroit is not an isolated weather anomaly that will clear with the weekend wind. It is a direct physical preview of an altered planetary regime where a flipped carbon vault systematically delivers its debt to human civilization, one breath at a time. The convergence of atmospheric data, carbon accounting, and biological impact leads to an inescapable conclusion. We are observing the structural failure of a global environmental barrier. For 10 millennia, human civilization developed within a remarkably stable climate envelope, constructed in no small part by the silent, steady operation of the northern forest biome. That cold ring around the top of the globe acted as an uncredited environmental buffer, absorbing millions of tons of industrial surplus each year and burying it deep within frozen soil layers. Today, that buffer has reached its physical limits. The assumption that nature will perpetually absorb human industrial outputs without changing its own internal dynamics has encountered the hard reality of thermochemical limits. The events observed over Detroit on July 16, 2026, demonstrate that the boundary conditions defining our regional climate have moved. When a fire season officially categorized as below average in total burned area can still generate sufficient particulate mass to push an American metropolis to an air quality index of 724, the baseline itself has fundamentally shifted. The baseline is no longer a static reference point anchored in historical averages. It is a dynamic, escalating trajectory governed by self-reinforcing feedback loops. The forest is no longer a passive background element absorbing human impact. It has become an active, self-feeding participant in atmospheric transformation. The physical mechanisms analyzed across this investigation, the ignition of deep legacy carbon, the winter-spanning survival of subterranean zombie fires, the decadal decay of thawed permafrost, and the albedo degradation caused by Arctic soot deposition, are not isolated phenomena. They are integrated components of a single planetary mechanism that has reversed its direction. A system that took 10,000 years to assemble its organic carbon vault is now dismantling those reserves across a handful of hyperactive burning seasons. The carbon released in these massive pulses does not remain local. It enters the global atmospheric pool, accelerating thermal loading, expanding the spatial and temporal limits of fire weather, and ensuring that future fire seasons will ignite with even greater ease and intensity. This is the rigid architectural reality of natural systems under extreme load. They do not fail gradually or linearly. They hold until they reach a critical threshold, and then they undergo a rapid change of state. The hazardous air that settled over the Great Lakes, darkened the skies of Manhattan, and reached across the ocean basin into Europe is the tangible emission of a flip biome. It represents an unyielding environmental debt, calculated in billions of tons of released carbon and paid in human health, reduced respiratory capacity, and heightened mortality. Human policy, international climate agreements, and economic models have long operated on the comfortable assumption that carbon reduction schedules could be managed entirely on our own timeline. The behavior of the boreal forest shatters that illusion. The planet's largest terrestrial carbon vault is now actively leaking, operating outside human regulatory frameworks, unbilled to any nation, and indifferent to geopolitical treaties. As the northern forest transitions from a reliable carbon sink to an expanding carbon source, it marks a permanent departure from the environmental baseline that built the modern world. The orange haze over our cities is